We on? Yes, thank you. Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to Geelong Regional Libraries. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight with the author Adam Courtenay, discussing his latest book, My Father Bryce. So my name's Elizabeth McCarthy. I'm the Program Director at the Queenscliff Literary Festival, and just to flag that our festival launch event featuring Hannah Kent goes on sale this Friday, so if you wanted to jump on queenscliffliteraryfestival.com.au, you're very welcome to. I would like to acknowledge sorry, I'm a bit puffed. Let's just slow down a bit. I'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Gulajan and Gadabanud people of the Maar Nations as the original owners of the lands on which these library services operate. And we pay our respects to elders past and present, and we acknowledge and celebrate First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. Geelong Regional Libraries is pleased to present tonight's event in partnership with the Wheeler Centre, and we'd like to say a special thank you to the Wheeler Centre for sharing this opportunity to host Adam in this region. And before we dive into the conversation, we'd like to let you know that tonight's event will be recorded, so if you'd like to watch the discussion again or recommend it to friends and family, it will be loaded up to the library's YouTube channel in the coming days. And if you have any concerns about the recording, please just let the staff know. So Gillian's just up the back if you wanted to talk to Gillian about that. Now let's start this main event. So let me tell you a bit about Adam. Adam is a Sydney-based writer and financial journalist. He has had a long career in the UK and in Australia, writing for papers such as the Financial Times, the Sunday Times, The Age, and for magazines including Forbes and Company Director. Adam has a love of Australian history and biography. It has written 6 books, including The Ship That Never Was, The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter, and 3 Sheets to the Wind. And tonight we're going to hear Adam talking about family, legacy and truth behind one of Australia's most cherished and celebrated and dearly loved authors, Bryce Courtenay. So this is about Adam's book that he's written as a tribute to his father, and as he's grappling with his own relationship still with his father. It's called My Father Bryce. So Adam, straight after Bryce passed away, you were offered book deals. You write in the book how some of them, were offered pretty much as soon as he died, and you were sort of horrified at the prospect of writing about your father so soon, but you've decided now is the right time. So I'm curious about why now.
Look, there's a lot of reasons that I took so long. Firstly, I didn't have, back in 2012, around the time he died, I didn't know how to write a book, and I had sort of thought this might happen at some point, but I didn't want to be one of those kids who write about their father, and that's the only thing you did. I wanted to be a published author in my own right, and I wanted this to be part of the greater pantheon of books that hopefully I would write in the future. But I knew that I would do it at some point. I knew that this is just a story that had to be told. Much of it, you ask why I do it. What the other reason that I waited so long, if that's kind of behind the question, is because it didn't end brilliantly. It was quite a tumultuous relationship. It wasn't terrible. We didn't fall out. We didn't have any sort of terrible time, and we didn't shout at each other. We had a few shouting matches, just a few of them. But it wasn't a terrible thing. But I was emotionally very upset at how things had ended. I believe that if you are going to write a memoir or a biography, I actually thought of it as more of a biography than a memoir, but it became so emotional that it's going to be a memoir. But I believe you have to put distance. So if I was to remember, even in my emotion or a bit of anger at the end of things, I said to myself, if I'm going to do this properly, I have to remove that more recent anger and be able to look at it as his life and my life with him as a whole. So if I can do it as a whole, then you'll get a better memoir, because the emotion's not in it, or the emotion would have come out, I would have worked things through. And then it took me roughly 10 years to get through that emotion, honestly, and then I felt I'm ready. So that's why it took so long.
Well, but there still is some rawness there for sure,
of course there
and
is,
there's still grappling, which I think, as someone who also has a complex relationship with a father who's passed away, you sort of are grappling with these things, with your emotions continually, but things fade, and you can actually put things more into perspective. Right. With time, and it's just time, isn't it?
Just time is a brilliant thing. It's a clarifier. I think it clarifies. People have often asked me, was this a catharsis? Writing, that's the number one question. Writing this, and actually it's not. I don't think it is, because you've gone through that catharsis in that 10 years, or what I had anyway. And not until that, as I say, you'd stripped the thing of emotion, you remember all the good things, not just the more recent things. Then what the book is then is a clarifier. In the act of writing, I believe the actual writing itself makes you able to, because you have to put it out to all of you who hopefully might read it. You have to be able to process. You've processed the emotion. Now you've got to process making that intelligible to somebody else, to others. So you can't. That's one of the reasons you can't do it with emotion, because you're going to make it less intelligible. It's going to be all about me, 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 and I think I like to think I've taken the me. I'm in it, of course, but I've taken that emotional, stripped it away, and you get hopefully a more thorough, much more all expansive look at the relationship. Because it's interesting you say that me, me, me thing, because your dad was very me, 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 God, yeah. Wasn't he? So let's set the scene for people, shall we, Adam? Because I'd like you to set up what this home was like. So there was yourself, your brother Brett, and your brother Damon, and mum and dad. So give us a snapshot of what the family atmosphere was like growing up. Look, I think it's a pretty normal one, except Bryce was in advertising. And I think that's the thing that sort of keeled it over. Yes, it'd be wonderful for a few days, but advertising in the 70s and the 60s was let's be honest, men's own, boys' own, whatever you want to call it. And I think that part of the job was to stay out and drink as much as possible with the clients. To get a client, you had to go up till 2 a.m. drinking. So there were some really bad sessions where he'd come home you wouldn't, absolutely stonking drunk. And because he felt that Bryce was a very competitive person. Those who have read his books, there's a lot of competition is part of one of the great themes that he has. He always believed, I have to be the best. And it was the same in the advertising world. Now, you asked me about the home. It disrupted the home enormously, especially when he went out on his own and did his own thing and wasn't working for a big multinational, which he was for most of the first half of his advertising career. Then he worked for his own, and it was really tough. It was during the early Whitlam years. He blamed Gough Whitlam for everything. He's taxing us and all this sort of stuff. And he wanted to put 3 boys through private school. It just got too much for him. And then, let's not forget, the other big thing at home was my brother Damon. He was a haemophiliac who would bleed, especially as an 8, 9, 10-year-old, bleed constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. And in those days, you couldn't do it at home. You had to wait all that night until 6 a.m. when the doctor arrived at the Children's Hospital in Sydney. And so he would suffer pain from, 4 o'clock in the afternoon till 6 o'clock in the next morning. And of course, Bryce had to take him in. And it wasn't until he was about 10 or 11 they allowed him to do it home. And that changed the family dynamic enormously, because it was such an onerous thing that we had to go to hospital 3 times a week just to give him this injection of a thing called cryoprecipitate, which would stop the bleeding. It was a clotting factor. So it was a little bit primitive back then, but God knows, at least they had the cryoprecipitate. 20 years before they didn't. So we were lucky in that sense.
So there's this dynamic going on with a very unwell sibling as well. And yep. I think you wrote so beautifully about Damon, and And, you know, his incredible dignity that he had right through his whole life, even though he was suffering in such pain for so much of his life. So you've painted this picture for us, but what else was going on was also your father's philandering.
Oh, yeah.
So, and that would have created, I imagine, significant tension between your parents,
Of course
because your mum knew what was going on.
Mum knew exactly what was going on. My mum was a very smart lady. I don't know whether this sounds right and people can disagree with me, but I think there was a thing in the 1960s and 70s where it wasn't talked about. You know, men just did what they wanted to do, and the wife just she had to bear it. And I know my mother, she would go absolutely, really crazy knowing that he was with someone. And he'd say, there was instances, for instance, in the beginning where he wouldn't come home for a weekend. And we just knew. I just knew. I didn't have to be told. And then he'd ring up sometimes saying he was so sick, he couldn't get into it, he couldn't move, or he had to help a person, or he was stuck in Newcastle or or something. And we just knew. Even I knew at 9, 10, 11. I knew what was up. But then he'd come home, he'd sort of sort it. I don't know how he would sort it with my mother. She just seemed to say, okay, he's back at least. He's back. We've got him. And then it would be fine. And so it was this very funny thing in that generation that it was almost accepted, or even though she couldn't accept it, it tore her apart. But then it tore her apart when she knew that he was, whatever he was doing. But afterwards when he came back, at least he was home and it was fine. And I couldn't have, even as a kid, I couldn't, well, how come my mother just accepts that philandering, not when it's happening, of course, but when he comes home, it's like he's not doing it anymore, so it's okay. It's not okay.
But Bryce comes across as such a charismatic person as well, and also an incredibly good liar. You know, and
a fabulist.
A fabulist, to put it kind of kindly, or to say it euphemistically. But one of the things that I grasped from your book is that he lied about his entire upbringing, and yet if he had have told the truth about it, people would have an enormous amount of sympathy for him. And to me, it wasn't an upbringing to be so ashamed of that you'd have to lie about it.
Yeah, look, that's, I think, the generational difference, because I know it sounds very silly, but you remember in the story I'm talking, when an English person used to walk into the room, especially someone of an educated English, my parents would start to mimic the way those persons, and you start using Englishisms. I don't know if anybody else experienced this. Maybe it was a Sydney thing. I don't know. But my friends would say to me, yeah, my mum and dad always do that too. Now, what I'm trying to say here, what's that got to do with the lying? That's about trying to pretend to be something that you're not. And their generation didn't feel happy with themselves. They've still had that link with England. Sorry, I'm going off the beat. Why did he lie about his? Because things like illegitimacy, it's the same. I think it's connected to that you don't tell anybody about your background. Plus, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, people had come from other places like South Africa. They didn't talk about what happened. It's a bit like people who come home from the war. That's there, and then we don't talk about, where I came from. This is what I am now. And if I want to pretend to be extremely high middle class, I will. And that's what their generation had to reinvent themselves, because they came from other countries or really, really difficult backgrounds. And they were all aspiring middle class people trying to be something that whether they were or not. My mother's the same thing. She came from, she was Jewish background, but very poor. Russian Jewish pogroms type stuff. And her father was a sailor, I think, and her mother was a homemaker. They weren't wealthy people. They certainly weren't the wealthy Jewish types that we always seem to, the trope that you get. So she was trying, in her own way, to be something that she really, she didn't. She was aspiring to be something, and she thought anyone with an English accent was superior. And I used to sit there as a kid going, why you change your accent, Mum and Dad? Now, I know that's not quite the same thing as
It's
you
a
asking
it's a
about the
cultural
illegitimacy, but
cringe.
I think it's linked. I think it really is linked. So I didn't quite hear.
No, it's really clear that they both have, and their set that they run with have cultural cringe going
Yeah,
on.
it's the worst kind of cultural cringe.
Yeah.
You know.
But on the other hand, at various points, Bryce was actually incredibly proud to be Australian and wanted to write the greatest Australian novels of all time and wanted these novels to sell everywhere overseas. He felt like sort of, he was a proud nationalist in many ways.
Wow, it was almost like, I try to show this in the first few chapters. South Africa was this black, dark place that he came from. But if he was going to talk about it, there was no truth involved. It was all, voodoo and all this sort of black African arts and all this sort of stuff, this strange place. And we just love it. Tell us more about South Africa. It's so incredible. It's so interesting. And he worked in the mines in South Africa. Well, it wasn't South Africa, it was in then Rhodesia. And it had this dark Twilight Zone feel about it. When he came to Australia, he felt that this is the way, the truth, and the light. He found this place. He found the people so much more honest. So they said what they meant, and they weren't hiding anything. Australians were, as we all like to say, fair dinkum, and he was that kind of a person who suddenly found his people. And he became so unabashedly Australian, and I can tell you, he never supported the Springboks in the rugby. He hated them. He hated South Africa. He hated so much of what South Africa was about. And he'd talk about it even as a kid. That the apartheid system revolted him because he was brought up by Zulu nanny. That stuff that you read in The Power of One. You may have read in The Power. That's all true. He was brought up, and he couldn't understand how anyone could treat. That was one of the things you ever always say about Bryce. He loved the African people, but he felt Australia. And when he came here, he always used to say, he'd see me with somebody of another colour. And this is back in the 70s when there weren't that many people of different colour. And he'd say, I see you talking to them, Adam, and I can see you don't even see their colour. That's what I love about this country. He believed it wasn't that racist. Of course, the Aboriginal people would disagree. But to him, coming from where he would see white guys telling black guys to, go, it was so obviously clear, whereas ours is maybe a bit...
Well, he saw segregation, whereas our segregation has been sort of camouflaged.
Yeah, I suppose it is. But he saw me and my friends mixing. It was becoming more multicultural among and not even thinking about it. And that's what he loved about Australia, because he thought it was progressing from into a more multicultural place, and he loved that idea.
And I guess it also gave him a place to reinvent himself, because his life story is one of constant reinvention, really. You mentioned before how he would go out and get raging drunk, but then there was one point where he discovered the joy of running, and that transformed him and reinvented him again. Could you talk about that?
Oh, yeah, look, Bryce was a bit of an evangelist. Running was the cure-all for everything. He had a very serious back operation, and took him, 4 months or 5 months to recover. And then he believed after that he could. I don't know where it came from, but he was always a very determined person. Whatever, and running was if things are going wrong, just go out and run. If you've got a cold or a flu, run will cure everything. And it became his new philosophy. And that came. Then he started running marathons, and then it chimed really well with that 80s thing, no pain, no gain. And he loved this whole idea. I mean, he was really into that sort of stuff. I run a marathon, and the pain makes me a better person. And I sort of was going, well, I'm not going to be running any marathons with you, mate. But I'd run with him, and then he'd thrash me because he was so much better than me. And he's 30 years older, and he could run the pants off me. But and a lot of that comes from his determination to succeed, of course. But running was the stepping stone from the bad old days of the 70s when he was drinking, and he stopped all that by the 80s, by the late 70s, early 80s, because he believed that when he was sick in bed from his back, that he had these thrombosis on his lung, and that was because he was in such terrible shape. And he said, either I go one way or I go the other. And he went the path towards running and becoming. So by the mid-80s, he'd run 6-8 marathons or something like that. And he was a born-again runner. All right.
And he also had a lot of sort of self-help kind of pieces of advice that he would throw around the home. Could you talk about? I mean, what was it like having a dad who was always about self-improvement and dispensing advice as he did?
I have to be honest. You'd think he'd be sitting there going, "That's not good enough. That's not good enough to you." And he wasn't like that actually. It's only later he became a bit like that. But he never to his credit, he never made me feel like I was. When we were growing up, from teenagehood, was roughly the time he was doing this running. He'd say, "That's my philosophy." He wouldn't push it on anyone. He would say, "I want you to be the best you can be," a lot. And I sort of thought, "I'm doing my best, Dad, as best I can." But I didn't have his whatever Bryce undertook. I was a determined character for the things that I loved. Now, I loved, as you see, I loved surfing and I loved rugby, and I was good at the things I cared about. He was good at everything he did. He couldn't not be good. A classic example was he in the late 70s, he started looking at Japanese calligraphy. Now, if anyone's ever had a Bryce Courtenay novel with his signature, it's brilliant. I don't know where he got it, because he loved calligraphy, and he became a fabulous calligraphist because that's what Bryce was into at that moment. And anyone with a signed Bryce book, it's incredible. It looks like Japanese, it doesn't quite, but it's very, very ornate. And he learnt that himself. So whatever Bryce did, he was determined to be the best at.
Can you talk about then how he went from being ad man to novelist? Because that process was also about Bryce being the best. But he also had a lot of nervousness about and anxiety about, how this first novel that he'd been ruminating on for so many years, how it would be received and how he could sell it to the world. So could you talk about, I guess, his anxiety about that, but also the process and why he decided to branch out into writing novels?
Yeah, he always had this book in his head, and I was a student of literature, and I'd sometimes tell him about what I was learning, some of the things, some of the techniques that they talked about in literature. And once I described a thing called semiotics, and they said the semiotics believe that when you write a book, it's like a radio wave. You go up, and then you have a climax, and then you come down, and then you go like that. And he said, "That's incredible. I've had a book in my head, and it's exactly what I'm thinking. Semiotics, what is that?" So Bryce, he wasn't, this is a funny thing, he wasn't particularly well educated, but he had so he'd been thinking about the semiotics on his own bat. I had to learn it. I mean, he'd actually thought that way. Anyway, that's beyond it. But that's when I realised, that was very early, late 70s, that he was writing a book in his head. So I reckon he was, all these stories he told me as a kid, and there's a few that I put in the book, he'd been beta testing me, if you know what I mean. He'd been testing them out on friends, and suddenly, come the late 80s, I think he said, "I've got to do this. I've got to write this book in my head." And he called it The Tadpole Angel. And so suddenly he got the bit in his teeth, and he started writing, and it was just going like this, like that. And I would ask him, I loved it. This is the power of one in its very early stages. And I thought, this is great. And my mother, who was much more literate than him, I should say, we thought we could see that it was just beautiful, brilliant, great sort of action writing, because that's what he was great at, very good at. And it was just, and then it was almost like a symbiotic thing. The more we said it was great, the more it spurred him on. And then I realised every now and then, said, "Well, what about he said, "No, I can't do that." So he wasn't asking at any point for our opinion, although he said he was. "I want to know what you think of and whether this is working." He was just asking for our approbation. Bryce wanted to be approved. He wanted this book. He didn't want, and then when he'd written it, it got to about this high. It was a giant thing, and he apparently sent it. And this is what he tells me. He sent it to publishers, and they all said, "What can we going to do with a manuscript? About a metre high, or so half a metre high." And then it just by pure happenstance, it was sent to Jill Hickson. And she said, "This is brilliant, but it's going to have to be just cut into half." All the while, he was sending it out, this giant manuscript, to all his friends, looking for the same approbation that he was getting from my mother and I. So the very first book was called The Tadpole Angel. I don't think he sent that many out but he did send a fair few, maybe 8 or 10 or something. So that's the original Power of One. And to this day I ask people, because he must have sent out scores of this, either the Tadpole Angel at first and then the Power of One when it had been renamed. He must have sent out 40 or 50. And people come up to me to this day and say, guess what, Adam? I've got the original manuscript. And I said, what's it called? And they say, The Power of One. I go, yeah, well, actually, that's not the original. No one has it. It doesn't exist anymore. Someone will step forward one day and say, I think I go off the train. The fact is, he wanted approbation. He was sending it out. It became what I call it in the book his feedback frenzy. But it wasn't like he wanted actual feedback. He just wanted people to say, it's marvellous, wonderful, fantastic. In the end, I just said, great, Dad, great. Everything you do is great. Because I didn't want to stop him. I didn't want to, rain on his parade. And of course, it got to Jill Hickson, and she said, this has got to be halved before it's even worthy of... So she did a huge editing job. Then she thought it was good enough to be sent internationally. So she sent it to her agent, and she halved it. So what actually you end up is what was becoming The Power of One is a quarter of what he originally wrote. So that's the process of writing that book, and it was a lot of other people who made it into something that became a great rites of passage story. But it was a year of editing and refining it before it. And Bryce says, I just went, nobody helped me, I just got it on my own. Of course, that's complete and utter BS.
One of the things I struggle with in understanding his psychology is that he actually is a very kind person to a lot of people. However, for things like The Power of One, he wanted to take all the credit, even though, as you write in the book, Jill did so much editing. Her agent partner overseas did so much editing as well. Yep. So, I mean, The Power of One, it sort of has these repercussions in that title. It's really the power of Bryce, isn't it? But so help me understand this, Adam, about Bryce being this sort of kind, generous, warm person.
But wanted to take all the credit.
But who wanted to take all the credit?
It's one of those things. He did this amazing. He would do so many generous things, but as he got more famous, it was like he was bestowing it upon the great man is bestowing his kindness on people, and it became almost evangelical. When he did it in the early days, I believe it was absolutely genuine. I believe because of the upbringing, and I go into his upbringing quite a lot, his upbringing was just terrible. I use the word peripatetic, which means that his mother would run them around the entire South Africa trying to evade, because he was born illegitimate. She was constantly moving. I don't know exactly why, but I think it's because she felt some shame. But anyway, I'm going off the point again. He had a terrible childhood, and in the early days, he could sense and feel the person in this room who was having a rough time. And that was part of his magic. And he would hone in on that person and say, I'm going to help you. And it got to the point when he became famous, when they'd all start coming to him. It was like he had a flock. This wasn't just readers. Bryce had his flock, and those people he would minister to. And I would see it happen. People would say, Bryce, I've got a problem, let's talk it over. I will help you. It became evangelical, the word's a very good word. It became partly religious. So Bryce would have his followers all across Australia, and he wasn't there to tell them a tale. He was there to help everybody. And that's when things got, for me, getting just badly distorted. And so I hope that helps in the sense that generosity, fame, if you add fame to generosity, that's what you get. You get this very distorted picture, I'm helping the world type thing. And he was a naturally generous person and naturally helpful. Before fame, it was fantastic. He would He would just do things for people because he wanted to do things for people, and there was never any sense of I'm getting anything back. He didn't care. He just wanted to help people, and because he felt like the underdog who'd been really had a rough time, and he sensed people's sadness enormously. He sensed my sadness on many occasions, and my brother's and other people's. He could feel that in a person, in a way. But it got distorted as he got older into, I'm going to help the world. It's just, as I said, I'm repeating myself. I didn't like that aspect because he wasn't as powerful as he believed he was.
So what was it like when you found out that all Bryce's stories about his upbringing were really, a lot of them were very untrue? What was that like? And talk us through how you found all that out.
It's a hard one to describe. You knew that he was talking BS, but he was so good at saying things that you just wanted to believe it. He made you want to believe the stories he was telling. Now, it's a funny thing. You and I, if we were to have an argument, anyone here, we'd use reason and logic to have an argument. And I would say, oh no, but the fact is that this happened and this happened and this happened, which means that this is why my argument makes sense. Bryce didn't do that. Bryce said, well, I tell you what, I'll tell you why I'm right. And he'd start telling a story. So he would, instead of me talking to you and explaining Bryce, I'd start telling stories about Bryce. That's how I can't do it. He's just amazingly brilliant at doing it. He would tell a story as a substitute for an argument that we would normally use. So we would use reason, logic, argumentative facts. He didn't care about facts. That's another thing. He would use a story as a means. And because those stories were so incredibly persuasive, doesn't make them right, but they were extremely persuasive. And that persuasiveness worked miracles for the people around, the people he was ministering to. He was so persuasive, and he got that from he told stories from, I think he called it camouflage. I think he was a brilliant way of diverting from the reality, to make people want to follow him or whatever, to believe in him and buy his books. Basically, he would use those stories as a craft, and he did it better than anyone I've ever seen. I've never seen anyone do that, in fact. I know.
So, but what was it like when you found out the truth about his life?
Okay, sorry, I've gone off center again. I'm very good at going off. It depends on what it was. He would tell me as a kid, oh, the Courtenays are descended from Robin Hood. There was a Robert de Courtenay who was a king of the Crusades in 1011. And I'm going, wow. But I also knew at the back of my mind, it's absolute BS. I didn't mind that sort of stuff. But there's a story that I build up in the story about him hiding his illegitimacy. I'm not even sure we're allowed to use that word. It's a bit archaic, illegitimate. But anyway, look, I'll use it because I don't know any other word. Born out of wedlock, whatever. And he hid that from me, and only a few people knew. My mother knew. I think my younger brother, because Damon and him were very close, he knew. And only when South Africa opened up in the early 90s, I met the South African family. And I was told by one of them that Bryce's sister, who they were the kids of, and Bryce were born out of wedlock. And I'm 30 years old at this point. I'm not a kid. I'm not a kid who needs to be protected. I'm 30 years old. I'm a journalist in the UK or whatever it was. Why didn't you just tell me? And it's all part going back to that thing that I was talking to you about them pretending to be something. We don't talk about being illegitimate. That'll put us in the lower class. It's related to that. And why I still don't really understand why he couldn't just be honest and say, sit me down when I was 18 or when I felt I was old enough and say, look, I think I better tell you the truth. All that stuff about that's the other thing I didn't say. He told us that his father was a crusader, he was a judge or a very prominent lawyer who crusaded against apartheid and died in a car accident a few months before he was born. So that's all I believed until I was 30. I thought, his father, and he tried to sort of say that I'm like that too. I was an anti-apartheid crusader, which he wasn't. But that's all by the by. Once those things were demolished in my brain, I just had this sense of, why can't you just be authentic? Why can't you just tell me the truth? And when I finally confronted him about it, he made me feel disloyal. And it's just not fair. Even 30, I'm still youngish, you know, and I'm sort of going, well, Dad, I don't understand. Why would you lie? And he said, I didn't lie. I was only told myself a few months ago that my father was this. He was an unemployed salesman of some sort, a clothes salesman. That's absolute crap. He knew since the age of 12 or 13 when he was told by his mother, and his mother said to him, do not tell anything of your origins or how you were born and what happened. Never tell anybody. Because their generation was even more uptight about all this sort of stuff. So the long-winded answer, I'm very long-winded, is the word wasn't anger, I wasn't upset. I was just incredulity, I think is the right word. Why would you hide this from me? We've had a great relationship for many years. Why is this something that needs to be hidden? My generation didn't give two hoots about, and many of my friends had been born, didn't have or didn't know who their fathers and mothers were.
He sort of did that classic thing, I think, when people get caught out, they humiliate the person who's caught them out.
It's called gaslighting. Yeah. He gaslit me.
So Bryce is in this household situation where, there's three sons who he loves, but there is a favoured son, and that's Damon. And Damon is, of course, very unwell, as we've talked about. Could you talk about the impact of Damon's death on all of you in the family?
Yeah.
Including your mum, of course.
I think it hit Dad, Bryce. I call him Bryce all the time. People pick me up for it. I don't know why I do. Maybe... It just changed the dynamic. Suddenly he just wasn't there. I was one of three, and now I'm one of two. My elder brother and I, we were just sort of like rivals, and we didn't get on that well. And suddenly we were getting on okay. And he wanted to now have a relationship with me because he felt the loss in that sense that there's only one left. Interesting, I talked earlier about the pain is gain thing. A lot of that came, I believe, the only person my father actually looked up to was his youngest son, funnily enough. The youngest one was the one, because Damon went through so much pain and then went through it and laughed his face off. His middle son was the one who was always complaining, who had nothing wrong with him and always a bit down on things. And he looked at me going, well, you've got all the advantages. This is what I think Bryce thought. You've got all the advantages, and you're always the one who's a bit depressed and a bit down and a bit... And look at him. He's got none of the advantages. He could barely walk half the time, and he's laughing all the way to whatever. Anyway, the fact is, Bryce looked up to Damon as an example of the greatest pain is gain thing. It's his philosophy, his personal philosophy that you get energy, you get great experience, and there's this younger son who's living it, and he looked up to him. And when he left, it hurt him incredibly, because Damon was almost the embodiment of his own power of one philosophy, if you understand. So he was embodiment, and it's gone. My mother, of course, felt like, she always felt this huge guilt because she'd passed on the hemophiliac gene to my brother. I just missed him desperately. But what can you do? You just have to move on.
And he was such a strong person. Like, he went to visit you in the UK before he died. Like, he spent months, he came over with his girlfriend, and you had sort of, really great times together. However, he was really suffering that whole time. I also wanted to ask about the fact that so after this all happened, the marriage broke down after decades together.
Yeah.
And that really, touched me. It was this sort of devastating impact on your mother who'd put up with so much, basically, and it's sort of, semi-turned a blind eye to everything.
Yeah, exactly.
And then suddenly Bryce has got this new lease of life, like it's over. And he told you first, didn't he, before he broke the news to your mother?
I feel... there was the guilt that I feel, that I think I'm honest about in the book, is that I never said anything about his long-time girlfriend of 30-something years, Celia, and that was always there. And I'd spend time with Celia. I really liked her. It's just, she's just there. She was always there from roughly the age of 12 or 13 that I remember her. And Mum knew about it. She'd say, "Oh, bloody Celia," or something like that. So it was just there, and I was. feeling like I knew Bryce had gone away running on a running trip with her or something, and I never say anything. And now Bryce calls me about 2 months before he's decided he's going to leave my mother for another woman, Margaret G. And he says, "Oh, I better let you know, you're coming back from England, this is going to happen." So I go back to Australia knowing that they're about to split up. And it didn't happen for the first 2 weeks. And then somebody, I won't go into the story, but my mother got informed. And I'm just thinking to myself, what have I done? You know, I should have maybe told my mother, but what can I do? It's not, look, I don't know if I probably did the wrong thing. I should have told her. But then
you were really young too. I
wasn't that young. I was 30-something.
Well,
early 30s.
Okay, maybe you should have told her.
Maybe I should have. But look, people don't tell stuff, and I'm forever guilty. The shock. Here's the truth, though. I think my mother knew all along what was going on. It wasn't just Celia. There was all kinds of shenanigans. And in the week before, there'd been something in the press, in the Sun Herald or something in Sydney, saying, "Ooh, famous author seen with young blonde," and my mother read it and said, "Bloody hell!" She knew exactly what was going on. She didn't say anything, but so she thought. I think that she thought that would just carry on like the Celia thing, and it'd be on the side. She didn't know that it was going to be the one that broke the camel's back. And then when it did, of course, I felt enormous guilt that I hadn't said anything, as I keep saying. And but I realised it's my time to look after my mum as best as I possibly can. But then I couldn't. I was back in England, but I did come back 2 or 3 years later, and tried my best.
We might take some questions shortly, but
Sure.
I thought maybe we could hear you read the paddle pop story, Adam.
Maybe part of it, just
Maybe part of it.
okay.
Yeah.
The paddle pop story.
So
I
this is
don't
early
want
in
to.
the
I actually don't want to tell you about the paddle pop story exactly. Because it's one of my favourite things, and I want you to read it. Yes, you must read it. But it's a very nice little story from the late '60s, and it shows Bryce's incredible generosity. But I'll do a little excerpt, kind of me in 1969, being a 6-year-old. Now you can work that out. I'm 61. But anyway, just a little bit, just to give a sense of what the world was like then. This is during, anyway, let me just say it. In 1969, the world was an incredible place in which to live. Not only had science put men on the moon, it was busy making outrageous new toys. It was impossible to keep up with the pace of change. But Brett and I had a secret weapon. Our dad was in the world of advertising, and he was involved in all kinds of new and exciting stuff. He knew what was coming and when, and that converted into big bragging rights at school. We had the future. You didn't. It was, when I think about it now, the ultimate in kid cred. Through Dad, we would know when a new flexible skateboard was about to land. There were yo-yos too, plastic ones with Coke and Fanta logos, mini bikes and battery-powered cars, toy trains with sleek green bodies, CB radios, remote-controlled helicopters that could fly. Television in colour had arrived. Television in colour had arrived in America. They were all coming, and Dad was a forecaster, perhaps the harbinger of it all. Even a 6-year-old could feel the buzz of living in the age of Aquarius. Some outrageous people were even wearing purple clothes. I was told by a very cool older girl that the colour was actually mauve. All over the world, hair was growing on heads and faces and other places too. You knew exactly who believed in freedom just from the state of their hair. Cool was hairy. Cool was hirsute. Cool was tangled, messy and free. The cars in the streets had been stripped of their 1950s atonal straitjackets and reclothed in new and exciting hippie colours. We thought the bright red car at the top end of our street was gas. It's almost the highest form of praise back then, gas. But it wasn't red, it was crimson. Aquamarine was very groovy too, the colour of meditation and reflection. While strange tie-dyed concoctions of red, yellow and orange spoke of revolution and danger. Progress was multicoloured. There's only 31 years until the year 2000, I remember Brett telling me. Brett was a couple of years better informed than me and far more numerate, and was also a science fiction nut. I was always interested in progress, but Brett lived for the future. The year 2000 was an important inflection point for kids in 1969. The future would arrive in all its glory on the 1st of January 2000. It just seemed like such a long time to wait. Dad, will cars be flying by the year 2000? It's related to a paddle pop, trust me.
There's a couple of roving mics, so if anyone would like to put up their hand and ask a question, don't be shy, please. Any questions?
I probably don't need a microphone. For the recording? Thanks, Adam. It's been great to hear your story. I had a similar relationship with my father that I won't bore you with now. I'll save that till afterwards.
Right, okay.
If your father hadn't been famous, would that have changed the way you wrote?
The way he wrote, or
The way you wrote the story about your father? It might not have
I
ever
probably
written
would
it.
never have written the story.
No.
I would never have written it. Let's be honest, there's a commercial appeal to Bryce Courtenay. I always wanted to do it, and of course I don't do it just for commercial reasons, but no one would have read it because he wasn't famous. I mean, let's be honest, that's why people do memoirs. I don't want to bullshit you, sorry, but people want to read about famous people, and that's why this is happening. But at the same time, I would have possibly written a memoir to myself. My mates would have read it. Probably nobody else. It's very, very, very hard to get a memoir up. I think the only two that I can think of that have really worked is A.B. Facey. He wasn't famous. He just had an amazing story to tell about Gallipoli, and it just worked. I mean, it was. That's one of my great books that I love. The other one is Eddie Jacku. You might have heard of. I don't know if it's so big in Melbourne because he was a Sydney guy. He was a guy who went through the Holocaust. It's called The Happiest Man in the World, I think he called it. The Happiest Man in the World, or something like that. That was just because those two guys had been through incredible, one the Holocaust, the other the First World War, Gallipoli, and the way they wrote, there's something naive about both of them. That it just doesn't matter they weren't famous, they just went to the top of the bestsellers because people could just feel what that people had been through. So the answer is I wouldn't have done it, probably. I am the first to admit I am leveraging off the fame of Bryce Courtenay. Let's be honest about it, you know. But I always wanted to do this, and not until I was a good enough writer, I felt I was a good enough writer, that I was going to attempt it. Hi. So I haven't even looked at this thing.
That's okay.
Hi, everybody there that I haven't noticed.
That's fine. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. I did notice that you referred to your father as Bryce, but your mother as Mum.
Yeah. Well, make of that what you will. It's probably a psychological thing. I'm the first to admit it.
Yeah, but I find it really interesting too. But when you said that you feel guilt about not telling your mother, even though your father was doing this almost all of your life, do you feel like your mother would have thought that you should have told her?
Can I be honest? I don't think she wanted to know. It was never said. These things were never verbally said. I think she knew, and I don't want to know about that. So part of me thought, if I told her, what on earth would I? He's not going to stop.
Exactly.
He's not going to stop. And there's nothing other. The only thing that I would be causing was more chaos.
Yeah.
And that's my feeling was, I'm not going to tell her this. Because I knew it instinctively she pretty much knew, even if she didn't know all the exact details.
Yeah.
What on earth? Now the difference was when I knew that he was going to leave her finally. That one, you know, I don't know what I'm not going to pretend that I did the right thing or know that whether I did the right thing. Probably not. But I wasn't going to break. It's again. I didn't want to see the chaos. I didn't want to be the cause of that chaos.
That's right. And I'm exactly the same age as you. And I put myself, when you were talking about that, I put myself in your shoes, and I feel like you did the right thing by not saying it, because she knew all along that he was doing it. So, but what I'm trying to say is, please don't feel too guilty about it. That was their decision. That was their marriage.
Well, look. So. I'm not saying look, that emotion, as I say, over the years, it's gone now. But I don't want look, without I don't want to sound. I want you to feel when you read this book that I'm not one of Bryce's superheroes. Bryce's heroes, I talk about this a lot, we're all perfect. And I'm highly imperfect. I made mistakes. I want those to be on the paper too, because you won't believe me, my commentary, unless I show my mistakes as well. And if you don't do it, one thing I was told about a memoir before I did it, if you're not honest, or you can't put everything in. I'm not honest about every single shenanigan that went on, but if you're not honest in how you felt, people won't believe you.
Any other questions? I think there are a few raised hands over here before, weren't there? No? I think there's, down here. Thanks.
Hi.
Hey Adam, how's it going? Thanks for the talk.
I know this, man.
Closer, yeah. I'm wondering...
Longer beard, so I didn't
You recognise
it.
what I was-
Now I do. Yeah, sorry.
I'm wondering how your view of your dad changed after writing the book, if it did.
Yes, it's a really great question. I know it probably sounds like I'm having a go at him a lot. As I say, this book created clarity about understanding him. I don't know if it gave me resolution. People say, well, where's the resolution? Well, life doesn't always give us resolutions, but it gave me clarity. And the greatest part of clarity is I began to understand the things I didn't like about the later Bryce, what I call the third act of Bryce, where he just did what he wanted to do and became fame-obsessed, etc. That's the part I disliked the most. And of course that's going to happen because I'm his son. He's now putting his attention to everybody else and not me. What about me, Dad? Type stuff, Look, the best thing this thing has done for me is because I began to realise when I looked closer at his early childhood that this was a kid that was so badly neglected by he didn't have a father, and his mother was just religiously obsessed. He had to invent stories, he had to create realities, his own realities, to compensate for a person that was being moved on every 5 minutes. He never had any friends. One thing I noticed as a kid, when he was telling me stories about South Africa, we'd go, oh, tell us another story. He was always alone. It was never, me and my mates did this and we went down. There was never a group of people. And then I began to realise when I was reflecting, he was abandoned by his mother. Now, and there's reasons for this, and I try to go into this in the book, and I'm not blaming her for everything, because there's always shades of grey. My feeling now is this desire for him to be famous and this unbelievable need to be admired, and this feedback frenzy that I was talking, is all related to right back then. And so the feeling I have now, from having looked at the whole thing much more intensely, is compassion for him. I was angry for various reasons that I've kind of touched on tonight, and it goes into the book. But this time I now have compassion, because I began to realise why he is exactly... Now, people have said in articles, you probably read, Bryce Courtenay, the big fat liar, blah, blah, blah. There's a reason, and I wanted to find that reason, and I think I did. And so when I found out that he was doing it to hide the terrible things that had happened to him, and that's where the lying mentality came through, I felt nothing but... I wasn't angry that he was a bullshit artist. I was angry... I began to say, I have compassion for this guy who has, let's be honest, came from the back blocks of nowhere to being the subject of all of us here in Geelong. The guy has... when you see what he went through, and you read it, you won't believe how he has surmounted his... And so many didn't, and he did.
Adam, I also had incredible compassion for his mother, because I think that she was brought up in this system and in this environment and this culture where women were shamed who had children in the way that she did. And I suspect she had several breakdowns along the way. From what you've described and the way she wasn't there for her children, to me there was some really serious stuff that she was going through as well.
Bryce talked about subterfuge, camouflage, all that thing. He must have learned it probably from his mother, because she would take the kids. She was cast out as a wanton woman for having 2 illegitimate kids from his hometown of Barberton in the sort of the northern part of South Africa. And everywhere she went, she had to pretend to be married, widowed. She was the widow. But people check things even back then, and so she would move every few months because people would find out who she is. She's this wanton woman. If you've had two kids illegitimately, it's only one step removed from being considered a witch in those days, and people would say and her family disowned her. So yes, I have incredible. And she put them in boarding houses and boys' homes and these terrible places that Bryce had to somehow make some life out of. But she always had them back.
Yeah, she always took them back. I feel like she did the best she could in her circumstances in a lot of ways.
Oh, I agree with you. And my mother tore into her when she met her, and I didn't understand why. Because I was only 15 when she came and visited Australia, and this little old lady, my mum was, she was heavily religious, which my mother didn't like, but that's okay. I said, why is my mother tearing strips off this little old lady who was by then late 60s, early 70s, I think. And then then it all clicked into place because there's been so much not knowing the full stories of things. My mother blames Bryce for his problem, for the problem, but I don't blame her. I think she fell in love with a guy. God, stuff happens, These days it happens every 5 minutes. And look, and things, but those
Just
days...
that people talk about it every 5 minutes these
That's
days.
true. I think it's become quite, it's actually a badge of honour, I think. Maybe. But yeah, I feel compassion for everybody. Everybody tried their best in very, very difficult circumstances.
We might wrap it up there. I really want to thank you for being so open and generous, Adam, and commend you on writing this fantastic book, My Father Bryce by Adam Courtenay. Please put your hands together for Adam.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I really...
And we're so lucky to have Matt from the bookshop at Queenscliff here selling copies of Bryce's book. So if you'd like to head up to the book stand over there, Matt will sell you a book, and I'm sure that Adam will be there signing copies as well.
I sure will be.
Thanks to everyone for coming along, and on behalf of Geelong Regional Libraries, we hope to see you here again soon. Thank you.